Hey friends, welcome back. My name is Shannon, and today we are going to talk about two Victorian classics that I have recently finished. October is a time in the booktube community where people celebrate Victober, which is where people read Victorian literature for the month of October. I do believe that there are some booktubers that host events and set up prompts to suggest some Victorian books to read. However, I don't follow along with the hosts or the prompts because I unfortunately just don't have the time. But I just so happened to be already reading these particular books for a course that I'm taking. So they fit in perfectly with Victober. And maybe you can use these books to satisfy some of the prompts that you may be following for reading Victorian fiction. The first book that I finished was The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. Now, George Eliot is actually a female Victorian writer born Marian Evans, but wrote her books under the name George Eliot. And this is actually a reread for me. I read this probably, I don't even know, 15, 20 years ago. But it had been so long that this essentially was almost a brand new book for me. I knew the ending and I knew the general gist of the story, but I really had forgotten almost the entire book. And so it was really great getting reacquainted with this book again. And The Mill on the Floss covers a 10 to 15 year period between the lives of Maggie and Tom Tulliver, who are brother and sister. However, I feel that this book truly focuses on Maggie and her relationship with three men, maybe four if you count her father. So the men would be her brother Tom, her friend and lover Philip Wakeham, and a forbidden lover named Stephen Guest. Now, Tom and Maggie are very, very close as children, but they have this very complex relationship. She loves him way more than he loves her, and he really only loves her for what she can do for him. He basically ensures that she is always subordinate to him and must do as he say, and he will withhold his love from her if she doesn't do the things that he thinks that should be doing. Now, this relationship with Maggie and Tom was based upon George Eliot's relationship with her own brother Isaac. It's not an autofiction novel, but she did take a lot of situations from her childhood and put them in this book. It's her most autobiographical novel. Now, Tom is very pragmatic and reserved, while Maggie is very passionate and she just wants so much. She wants education. She wants experience. Now, Maggie's always getting herself into trouble because of her passionate nature. For example, she once dunked her hair in water when her mother commented on how the curls just wouldn't tame. And then she later cut her hair when she cut it all off when an aunt made a comment about it. And even went so far one day as running away to go join the group of Roma people that were happening to pass through town on that particular day. And Maggie she just wants so much. And women just weren't allowed to have these things that she wanted. She wanted independence. She wanted education, and she just wasn't allowed to have it. Now, Mr. Tulliver, who is probably the fourth male relationship that is covered in this book, realizes that Maggie is smarter than Tom, smarter than any woman probably should be at that time. But he says that intelligence is not good for women, and thus he focuses his money on educating Tom, not on educating Maggie. He even says, "The little one takes after my side now. She's twice as cute as Tom." Too cute for a woman, I'm afraid, continued Mr. Tulliver, turning his head dubiously first on one side and then the other. "It's no mischief much while she's a little one, but an overcute woman's no better nor a long-tailed sheep. she'll fetch none the bigger price for that. Now, by cute, Mr. Tulliver is meaning acute. It's a contracted form of acute, meaning she's too smart. And so he's essentially comparing her to a sheep on the farm. Basically, her intelligence is not going to get her a better husband in the marriage market. That being said, Mr. Tulliver is actually, secretly proud of Maggie's intelligence and even boasts of it to some people. Now, I think that Maggie's father is probably the only man in this novel that actually loved her for who she was. And he even tells Tom that he must always be kind to her and take care of his sister. Mr. Tulliver had a soft spot for his own sister and really wanted to take care of her and be there for her. And so I really do think that when you read this novel and you analyze the relationships that Maggie has with all of these different men, her father's the only one that really does love her for who she is, for her passionate nature, for her intelligence. So Mr. Tulliver sends Tom to school. And when Tom is at school, he meets another boy named Philip Wakeham. And Maggie one day comes to the school to visit Tom, meets Philip, and Philip becomes entranced with Maggie. They're little at this time. The boys are probably teenagers. Maggie's maybe like 10 years old or so. So it's not like he was in love with her at that time, but he was very, very interested in her, and he liked her, and she liked him, and they were friends. So as we go along, there are various family crises that intensify Maggie and Tom's differences, and nothing that Maggie does will make Tom happy, but she will still do anything and everything just to make him love her. So now we have these crises. Tom goes out to work while Maggie, who unfortunately is not allowed to satisfy her intellectual goals, has to languish at home with her mother. She can't go away to school. Now there's no money, and Tom has to go out to work. Philip is the only one at this time who sees Maggie's intelligence and is the only one that will encourage such intelligence. However, he does take advantage of her youth and innocence and coaches a pledge of love out of her. At this time now, it's a few years later, Maggie is a little bit older. So she's not the 10-year-old pledging love to Philip Wakeham. She's older. They're both teenagers, and she's been spending time with Philip, and they've been really growing to care about each other. And Philip is the only one that really encourages her to read and broaden her horizons. However, the distress that the Tulliver family is going through is related to Philip's father, who is a lawyer. Now, because of this, when Tom finds out that Maggie and Philip have been spending time together, he absolutely forbids Maggie to see Philip. And she agrees because she absolutely loves her father and she loves her brother, and she does not want to do anything to cause them harm. So she gives up Philip. And so this causes Maggie to have, a spiritual crisis, essentially. So along with renouncing Philip, she essentially renounces the world. Instead, becomes kind of a bit of a masochist, almost punishing herself for her worldly wants. She's punishing herself for wanting so much and causing so much distress to her family. So she gives up all her books, gives up all her desires, and it becomes like a bit of a fanatic, and instead reads only scriptures, and she suppresses any and all passion that she once had for life, believing that this suppression was for the good of others. Philip essentially represents the bigger and more cultured world that she is forced to give up. So she gives up her books, she gives up Philip, and she just basically punishes herself for wanting these things. Years pass. Mr. Tulliver passes away, Maggie ends up going out to work. She refuses to stay at home and be kept by her brother, who by this time has been doing an excellent job in business and has essentially reversed the Tullivers' fortunes. He has brought some respectability back into the family. But Maggie does not want to be kept by her brother. At a visit to her cousin, Lucy Dean, the in-between work situation, so now Maggie is, I want to say 17, 18 years old at this point. So she's in between jobs. She goes to visit her cousin and she meets a man named Stephen Guest, who is the suitor, a very wealthy suitor of her cousin Lucy. Maggie now becomes the object of desire of Stephen Guest. And Stephen really only sees her as a fascinating object. She's different from other women, and he doesn't love her intelligence the way that Philip does. He just sees her as something to look at. It's a very shallow admiration that he feels for her. Stephen's admiration is essentially allowing her to re-enter the world that she had renounced. But by re-entering this world, she still brings turbulence with her because, all right, this guy is, even though not engaged to her cousin, kind of like almost engaged to her cousin. So she's bringing turbulence with her. And she does become attracted to Stephen, but this is complicated by the fact that Philip is good friends with Stephen. So now Philip is back in her life. So Maggie is now struggling with her love for Stephen, but she's also feeling guilty because she once pledged her love to Philip. And she's also feeling guilty because of what it's going to do to Lucy. And then she's feeling guilty about, Tom and even her father. So she's talking to Stephen and talking to Philip, and she's got all of, these wants, but then she has all these duties that she feels that she owes to these other people. So now we come to an incident that happens that is completely not Maggie's fault. Yet this incident causes her to be an outcast. And after this incident, she goes to her brother to talk to him. And he says some of the most horrible, horrible things to her and turns her away. And I lost it at this point. I was hysterically crying. I was just absolutely heartbroken. And I had not cried this hard with a book for a very long time. And it wasn't so much that her brother was rejecting her, but in this scene of being rejected by her brother, her mother, who was treated throughout the book as just this very, very silly woman, came out of the house and said to Mary, "You still have me. You still have your mother. I will go with you." Basically, going against her own son, who was caring for her because she lost her husband. Oh my God, that scene where the mother finds her strength and goes with her outcast daughter. I'm tearing up. Goes with her outcast daughter. I lost it. Completely lost it. Hysterical crying for like 20 minutes. My partner was out, oh my gosh. My partner was out mowing the lawn, and I was trying to calm myself down so that he wouldn't see me crying over a book. But I was just such a moving scene. The scene, see, I'm crying now. She and her mother go off together, find some lodgings in the local provincial village that they live in. And Maggie tries her best to live amongst these people. And she is helped, obviously, by her mother. And a local clergyman also tries to rehabilitate her reputation, but it just doesn't work. The people are just ignorant and unforgiving. And she's planning on leaving the village. She even tells her mother, "Go back to Tom. I need to do this on my own. Go back to Tom. He will take care of you. I'm going to go out on my own. So at this time that she's trying to figure out what to do, there comes a historic rain, which causes some historic flooding in the area. And then it is this incident that actually reunites Maggie and Tom. However, it's not the type of um, reuniting that you may expect. And I'm not going to tell you more about how they get reunited and what happened. Although this book is very tragic and at times very sad, there are some really excellent scenes of levity in here. This is actually very funny. There are some very, very funny scenes in here, specifically with the aunts. They're Mrs. Tulliver's sisters, the Dodson sisters. They float in and out of the novel like a chorus. And they are experts in everything from linens to mortgages to curly hair to being obedient to your family, to family duty. But they are funny. And Eliot really does a great job with taking this tragic story and infusing some moments of humor in here. So don't think when you read this, it's just going to be all sadness for Maggie's, tragic story. There is some humor in here. This is also an example of the quote unquote woman problem novel. So there is a lot to explore in here, specifically with how women were viewed and treated in Victorian England. You've got marriage, you've got education, you have sex, you have independence. And like I said before, this is the most autobiographical novel that George Eliot wrote, because Eliot herself ended up having to break with her brother because of the lifestyle she was living. She was living with a married man, and her brother basically rejected her. And unlike Maggie and Tom, who were reunited, she was never reunited with her brother. She never saw him again after he rejected her. I feel like this book is just really Maggie just wants to be loved and loved for who she is. The next book that I finished was Mary Barton by Elizabeth Gaskell. I am going to have a hard time talking about this book because I really don't even know where to start. I have been sitting here for about an hour trying to get my notes somewhat cohesive, and I haven't really been able to. So forgive me if I'm a little bit all over the place here. So Mary Barton, written by Elizabeth Gaskell, is an example of a Victorian social problem novel. And a social problem novel or social protest novel is fiction where a specific social issue is dramatized through its effect on the characters. Today we have social problem novels, so they're not unusual, but at the time they were, popular in Victorian England because Victorian England was going through such substantial change. Charles Dickens wrote many a social problem novel, Oliver Twist being one of them. And I think, I could be mistaken, Oliver Twist actually helped pass legislation for childhood workers, I believe. So these social problem novels did affect change. This was Elizabeth Gaskell's first novel, published in 1848. Some of you may know that Elizabeth Gaskell also wrote North and South and Wives and Daughters and the Cranford Chronicles, but this was her first book. And this was written in order to get over grief at losing a child. So Elizabeth had lost a baby. I don't know if it was her first baby or not, but she had lost a child, and her husband suggested, maybe you should write a book to take your attention away from your grief. So this story is set in a particular economic period in the 1840s of England, which was called the Hungry Forties. And a couple of things were going on during the Hungry Forties. You had the Corn Laws, which was keeping the price of bread very, very high. Then there was the potato blight that started in England and Scotland and then moved over to Ireland. So you've got the potato famine, which in Ireland caused heavy immigration from Ireland to the US, specifically in Boston, where I'm from. So um, lots of economic upheaval. And another part was also the overproduction of cotton that wasn't able to be exported. So this book is set in Manchester, which is a northern town, and their industry was cotton. So because of the overproduction of cotton that wasn't able to be exported, people in Manchester were suffering an economic depression. In addition, around this time of the Hungry Forties, there was also the Opium Wars with China. And so because of this, British exports of cotton and opium to China were severely curtailed. So the mills weren't operating, the factory workers were out of work, and thus you have poverty and misery, and we have Mary Barton. I feel like we have two separate stories here. John Barton and Mary Barton, right? So John Barton is the father, Mary Barton is the daughter. Originally, Gaskell was going to call this book John Barton. He was the original main character. And I had to do a little more research as to why she decided to change her mind. But I feel like she should have just kept it John Barton. And I'll explain why in just a minute. So the first half of the book, we're essentially focusing on John. And we're learning about his family, how he loses his son due to malnutrition. And the malnutrition was caused because he was out of work and essentially couldn't feed his children properly. So he loses his son. Then he later loses his wife. And so then it's just John and Mary Barton, the daughter. And so he's raising his daughter, and he's very concerned about raising his daughter. John is constantly questioning the distribution of wealth, and he absolutely hates the middle class and the wealthy. He hates them. John is also a Chartist. So the Chartism was a working class movement at the time for political reform, specifically in areas of the country that depended upon a single industry. For example, cotton in Manchester. And these single industries were subject to wild swings in economic activity. And some of the things that the Chartists were fighting for were mainly, essentially, male suffrage. They wanted a vote for every man aged 21 and above, because not all men in England were allowed to vote. And that's one of the things that was very important to the founding of the United States, was that all men, white men, were allowed to vote regardless of whether you owned land or not. So they wanted no property qualifications for members of parliament so that people can vote for whoever they choose. They wanted members of parliament to be paid so that the tradesmen and working men who had to leave their livelihood to perform their MP duties were able to do that, so that families weren't starving while they went to do what they had to do as members of parliament. And then there were other requests of Chartism related to voting and elections. Chartists were not popular with the factory owners because they tended to disrupt things. They wanted unions. They wanted things that the factory owners just weren't willing to give. And John, in his capacity as a Chartist, attends meetings. He even travels to London to make a case, only to be denied that opportunity, which causes him to be very, very angry. And throughout the first half of the novel, we are watching John descend into anger and hatred and even addiction. It's probably not a coincidence that this is set during the Opium Wars because John ends up becoming addicted to opium. And I have a note here where I call it, is this the quote unquote fall of John Barton, like a Paradise Lost type thing? And it could be. Elizabeth Gaskell was the wife of a clergyman. So this is going to be a very, very Christian novel. There are very graphic depictions of poverty, misery, and death of the people affected by the economic downturn. And I am very sure that these depictions were realistic, although I'm sure some people who had never witnessed them probably thought it was very shocking, almost like a shock value. In turn, there's also depictions of the ease of the factory owners. And even though those factory owners are affected by these economic downturns, they are still able to eat and drink and have parties and marry off their daughters and still be okay while people are truly starving in the Manchester streets. And then at various times, Gaskell is also commenting on industrial versus agricultural. So even though the country or the agricultural workers are idealized, they're not much better off than the industrial workers. So we've got commentary on rich versus poor, industrial versus agriculture. I feel like the agricultural versus industrial case is better made in North and South. So if you've read North and South, Margaret Hale comes from the idealized agricultural South and has culture shock when she moves into the industrial North. That is definitely much better done in North and South. So meanwhile, throughout all of this depiction of poverty and misery and John's descent, we are watching Mary go about her life, living with her father, happily first, obviously devastated when her mother passes away, but then she has a difficult time watching her father descend. And she spends less and less time at home. She goes out to work, and she ends up having two men vying for her affections. Jem, who is a childhood friend in whom she gives absolute no encouragement at all to his affections. And then Harry Carson, who is the son of a wealthy factory owner who she does encourage. Because Mary is not stupid. She knows that marriage to Jem won't necessarily bring her out of her poverty, but marriage to Harry will. So does Mary love Harry? I don't know, but it is an economic decision that she's making when she encourages Harry's attentions. So now the second half of the book focuses on Mary. And this is where things go off the rails for me. All right. So a murder happens, and Jem, her childhood friend who loves her, gets accused of the murder. And it's a wrongful murder charge. And we lose John Barton here. The second half of the story is Mary realizing that she loves Jem and she needs to save him. So the whole second half of the book is Mary's adventures in saving Jem Wilson from this wrongful murder charge. Gaskell connects the stories, but not until the end. So it was very jarring. I felt like I was learning all about John and all of the injustice and everything that was happening. And then we lose him, and then we're following Mary. And we come back to John, but not until the end. But by then, everything was it was so jarring. I just didn't know what was going on. Some critics said the same thing. They're like, what happened here? What is this love story between Mary and Jem? This does not fit in here with the overall theme of this book of John Barton trying to, figure out this life in Manchester. It was just two different stories, and I couldn't reconcile the both. And then you have other critics who are saying, no, 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 this is Gaskell had to do it this way. This is definitely the right way for her to bring the story of John Barton full circle by this love story of his daughter. I'm of the opinion that it didn't quite work. So I just felt like we should have stayed with John. Another criticism that I have about this book is that there were major plot points that were described only indirectly instead of using dramatic scenes. Basically, the narrator is telling us, hey, this major thing happened, but we don't actually see it happening. So it was really strange. So Gaskell went back and forth between dramatic scenes and just the narrator saying, well, this happened. So that I thought could have been done a little bit better. We do have a touch of the sensation, a little bit of a sensation novel in here, though it's not a full sensation novel. One of the sensation points is there is this big court case, and Mary does all of these things to try to save Jem, and she ends up in court testifying, and then collapsing afterwards. And so we've got a touch of the sensation. We have a touch of the melodrama. There's a scene in here where Mary is chasing a boat in order to catch a certain person on that boat who will have an alibi for Jem. A little bit melodramatic. It's also tragic. There's a lot of death in here. A lot of people die. However, I find that kind of realistic, because if people are, starving, they're living in poverty, then yes, a lot of people are dying. So you've got some sensation, you have some melodrama, you have tragic elements. Gaskell is definitely making commentary on both economic and politics, but she'll sometimes have her narrator say that she doesn't really understand either thing, but I'm just showing you what has happened. Gaskell knows. Gaskell definitely knows the economics. She knows the politics, but she's almost trying to say to her reader, well, I don't really know what's going on, but I'm just telling you what happened. You need to make up your own mind here. So I thought that was interesting. That's not necessarily a criticism. I just thought it was interesting. And another criticism is Mary is just really a disappointing heroine. Gaskell really does not know what to do with Mary. She has Mary do all of these things that a heroine should be doing. The heroine has to go out and save her man. She has Mary do things that Victorian women should not be doing. She's got a touch of the independence. She goes out and she goes and saves her lover. She goes and she chases that boat to get that alibi. But then she's like, okay, well, Mary does all of these things to save her lover, but that also almost makes her unfeminine. So what do I do now? I've now made Mary unfeminine. What do I do? Okay, I've got to make my readers see that she is still a feminine woman and she is still a good Victorian woman. What do I do? And then Gaskell just makes her collapse at the end and almost like be reborn as this ideal Victorian woman who's now going to look at Jem as, like looking at a parent for the first time. You're going to take care of me. And I don't know. I don't even know how to describe it. I'm not doing a very good job of describing it. So it was almost like we've got the part one political novel, part two domestic novel. How do we get the domestic Mary back? North and South makes very similar points. Okay. You've got the industries and the factories and the masters not understanding the workers and the workers not understanding the masters. And what are we going to do about it? Gaskell does a better job of making these points and interweaving a love story into it. Because if you have to have a love story, which is what she did here, she obviously felt the need to have a love story in here. She does a much better job of making the political and economic statements and interweaving the love story in North and South, in my opinion. North and South does not have the graphic depictions of poverty that are so prevalent in here, and I do feel like are very important. The depictions of poverty are just absolutely heartbreaking and realistic. They aren't so prevalent in North and South, but I do think the point gets across better in North and South, and the love story woven in a little bit better. Alana Estelle, who is here on BookTube, has an excellent review of Mary Barton. Way better review than I'm giving you here, because I'm kind of off the rails here. I can't really explain this as well as she did. So I will link her video in the description box so that you can watch a much better review of Mary Barton, and you can decide whether you want to read this book or not. She says that Mary Barton is a grittier version of North and South, and I 100% agree. I didn't like this book, even though all my criticisms of it, I did like it, but I liked it as something to study, not necessarily to enjoy. Now, I will read North and South for enjoyment. I enjoy that book for the story, and I enjoy to study it. But this, I really do feel like this is more for me to study than to enjoy. I'll probably read it again, like I said, for something to study, but I probably won't read it just because I'm going to enjoy it. So because I think that this is a book more to study, I highly recommend this edition, the Norton Critical Edition, because it has some excellent additional goodies in the book. And I'm half tempted to replace all of my Oxford and Penguin classics with Norton Critical Editions, because such good information. All right, so just so you know, this was Mary Barton here. So it's not that long of a book. So it may look like people will be like, oh my God, that is a thick book. It's not. This is Mary Barton. This is all of the extra information that the Norton Critical Edition gives. So you essentially got 2 books in here. Excellent stuff. So a lot of so it gives both criticisms for and criticisms against. And then there's a lot of people writing essays on, the results of industrialization, the mutual dependence of men in a social state, the feminization of working class men, maternal authority and Mary Barton, class antagonism in the sexual plot. So really great stuff to help you learn more about the text. And I did read all of this, but even after reading all of this, I'm still conflicted. I still don't know what to think about this book. All right, so 2 Victorian books for possibilities for Victober. I thoroughly enjoyed my time with Maggie. I enjoyed my time with Mary, but not as much. And but these are 2 really great Victorian books to read, and I do recommend them. So let me know if you read these books, or if you're planning on reading them. And if you've read them, what do you think? What do you think about Maggie? What do you think about Mary Barton? I really want to know what you think. Have you read it? Did you find the story, the story of John and Mary as jarring as I did? Or do you think it worked? Do you think this worked the way that Eric Gaskell did it? And what do you think about poor Maggie? My girl Maggie. Let me know. I really want to hear your thoughts on these. So that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining, and have a great day.